I just recently finished Cronos: The New Dawn, a Blooper Team's new survival horror game. It launched just this month in September, and it's really their first original release after Silent Hill 2 remake, which is a big deal because before Silent Hill 2 remake, there was always a sort of contentious feeling about Bloober Team that, yeah, they make serviceable horror games, but they never seem to elevate the genre until they came out with Silent Hill 2 Remake and actually exceeded our expectations that this is a team that actually knows what they're doing. But can they recapture that thunder in a bottle feeling again with a new original IP, with Cronos: The New Dawn? You know, Bloober Team's history matters a lot because they've made games like Layers of Fear, Observer, Blair Witch Project, and even most recently, The Medium. And so I stepped into this game with a renewed perspective that this is a team that is really trying to prove itself in the horror genre, trying to stand out from the rest of the crowd. Did they succeed in this? Did they not? Well, let's get into it. So, of course, let's start off with the fact that Cronos: The New Dawn is a sci-fi survival horror. The setting really flips between a ruined future and a 1980s Poland during a disaster called the Change. And so you move through these rifts and cross a decayed industrial city and try to piece together what really happened here because you're playing as someone called the Traveler, who is this time traveling agent working for an organization called the Collective. Your job is to pull essences from key people in the past and carry them forward to help solve the mystery behind this outbreak. Most of the plot kind of arrives through notes and logs and these short cutscenes. And here's where I ran kind of into some of the problems. Once the game starts juggling the past and the future subplots, the plot kind of feels a bit cloudy and it doesn't always reward you for digging into the details. I read so many notes that I felt were not relevant to piecing the puzzle of what's really going on here. You know, the what's and the where and the why. A lot of flavor texts is the best way I can describe it, but no substance. And I kept waiting for a sharper turn that really never came. By the end, I felt like the big answers were either brushed past or kind of left vague, with a narrative payoff that I don't think was serviceable. That's really how I feel about it. I'm not the only one who felt that. Even several reviews called the narrative confusing, and more than a few mention an underwhelming payoff. That's kind of the best way I can describe this storyline. Even as I was playing it and streaming it, some of my viewers who were watching from start to finish and were trying to theorize and piece together that story, they really, at the end of the revelation that we got, was like, that's it. That's really what all this was. And it does kind of, I'd say ultimately tarnish the overall experience. But let's talk about atmosphere and level design, because I think they're very, very strong in Cronos: The New Dawn. The spaces, they look harsh and believable. You have a variety of environments that you will traverse, like the steelworks factory, the housing apartments, the tunnels, the offices, all feel very meticulously designed, and all kind of wrapped around a great audio design that I think is very effective, and really adds to the immersiveness of this game. This is kind of the part of the game that always, I think, has worked from start to finish, and I think it helps sell that world, ultimately. It's all these small little touches that makes the world dreadful and almost downright apocalyptic. in a way that I'm like, I want to know what has happened here. Why did this happen? The world itself is what kind of really reeled me in more than the story, strangely enough. Gameplay also is it's sometimes strong, but sometimes mixed. I think the shooting itself is somewhat in the middle for me. It feels heavy. And that's deliberate. I don't mind that. And so that means, your regular shots also are very weak. And so you have to kind of charge up your weapons with every shot, because it's just not enough to shoot willy nilly with your gun. You have to make every bullet kind of matter, which also coincides with your character's movement. So you have to be able to strategically plan out how you're going to outmaneuver the enemies, and kind of also make sure that you're managing resources at the same time. So charging up your shots is so important, because you want to be able to penetrate the enemies, as they can be tanky, just as tanky as your movement. So using the environment to your advantage, for example, shooting gas canisters or traps to sort of save up on ammo becomes a very smart way to play. And I would say the core mechanic, now, the selling point of the survival horror aspect of this game is something called the merging, which, if you leave bodies on the floor, other enemies can end up actually absorbing them, and they can evolve to become even stronger enemies. The way to really stop them is to burn those corpses quickly. But of course, burning corpses requires a specific kind of resource that you need to craft. And when you have limited resources, that makes it harder, and you have to compromise and really pick and choose your battles as to when and where you want to burn those corpses and deal with the rest. And this rule kind of makes the fights really tense. However, it can be very, very punishing to the point of downright frustration. If you are not managing your resources properly, you can go into a fight almost under prepared. And that could be a little bit jarring for some players. And even for me, as someone who's very careful in survival horror games, if I slip up once, what starts off as maybe as a winnable fight turns into an absolute mess. Again, it has to be, I understand that it's a survival horror, and it has to kind of go down that route. But I do worry at times where it borderlines to the point of frustration more than, fair difficulty. And so this is where enemy encounters can kind of, swing in quality. I think there's always the enemy encounters can have some. It's all really about the way I've experienced it is, how does every enemy encounter force you to make a choice? Do you want to kind of outmaneuver them and try to get all the enemies into a line so you can fire a charged shot on them? Do you want to bait them all to an explosion and then kind of all burn them? Do you want to reposition? And like, I think the best arenas in the game are all about that. But the worst ones is when the spaces are far too small, they're far too tight. And so, especially with your guns being, they're constantly swaying, and you miss those very expensive charged shots. That's where I think some areas can feel extremely unfair, and it can be a grind to have to push through some of these areas. And more than, a lot of the combat frustration, there's also the fact that, you're constantly having to dabble with ammo economy. If you don't know how to manage your resources, you will be punished even more. So the game punishes you for carelessness, and it forces you to plan strategically, and that's great. But some areas can feel just borderline unfair. And it never has to, I don't want a game to feel that way. It should be, if I die or lose, it's because, yeah, you know what? It's my fault, and that's fine. But when it's You go into a level and you're fighting all these enemies, and you tried your best with what you had, and it was still not enough, and you came in underprepared. Where do I draw the line? Do I say it's bullshit? Do I say mm, this is just part of the experience? Some people might not feel the same way, and that's it. Shouldn't feel like that when you have an inconsistent kind of uh, player feedback about those levels. Then you got a game that has really mixed receptions. Did the developers do a good job? Who knows? It's really up to the player how they felt. And I felt mixed about it. Some areas were good, some areas were just downright bullshit, in my opinion. But let's talk a little bit about that story again because it does matter. I like that. I personally like slow burn kind of plots, but this one spreads itself way too thin. I don't think it had enough substance to make a storyline 15 hours long. The game hints at these big ideas of about memory and control, but it keeps all these important details at arm's length, and I had to piece together too much from scattered logs and late reveals that and the late reveals themselves didn't feel worth the wait. Like the time you put to trying to theorize and piece together the storyline didn't have a great payoff. And I have to say, at times it was very confusing, and ultimately it was an underwhelming storyline. So for me personally, you think with everything that they've built, the the story department was perhaps the weakest right after the combat. Performance and polish, I think, was pretty fine. I did not really face any issues with the performance, especially on PC. I don't know what the game was like on console. I'm sure it was just fine. I never really had any even issue with Silent Hill 2 remake when that game came out on PC. So in terms of performance, no issues on my part. So here's the bottom line. I personally would only recommend Cronos: The New Dawn if you want classic survival horror with strict resources, and if you enjoy planning out your fights, and if you can live with a story that sometimes feels very muddled and an ending that doesn't really pay off, and you are craving a Dead Space-esque kind of experience, then I would recommend this game for you. I think the audio design, the atmosphere, and at times the rules of combat can carry this experience. But if you're someone who would rather have a more flexible gunplay, more steady difficulty, and a clear, satisfying narrative payoff, I'd really skip it and maybe wait for a discount. I am a sucker for horror games. I love this genre to death. And it's because I love it so much that I have to be critical. I think Cronos: The New Dawn does some really great things, but it still makes its way to the finish line in a way that is underwhelming. This is Bloober team that still feels like it's still learning to do things right. And despite the fact that he did an amazing job with Silent Hill 2 Remake, I have to remind myself that they had the blueprints to make that game great, right from the get-go. And they just had to execute on that. But when they are making new and original IPs of their own, they still seem to fumble in some kind of way. I will say that Cronos is at least better than some of their predecessors, like Layers of Fear, which felt like a Silent Hill PT clone, or The Medium. Medium, I dropped it after 2 hours. I could not stand the tediousness of it. I think this game is at least a lot more engaging, a lot more atmospheric, a lot more immersive, but the story is lackluster. And I think they still need to work on that a little bit more. I am definitely excited for what they're going to work on next. I'm glad they are also developing new IPs while they're obviously working on the Silent Hill remake that was confirmed by Konami. And I'm always excited to see what they will. I just want them to continue to prove themselves and and improve on their weakest factors. So I'm cheering them on, and I can't wait for what they do next. But Chronos, the new Dawn, definitely felt like a game that I was initially excited for, but ended up coming out of it pretty underwhelmed. It's a serviceable survival horror video game. Does it elevate the genre? No, it does not. But it still leaves a it still does a few great things that I think could give other studios some great inspiration moving forward. And that is my review for Chronos: The New Dawn. Thank you guys for listening listening to this review. If you also have played the game, I would love to hear your personal experience. What did you think of the game yourself? Do share your thoughts, the good, the bad, the ugly, or what they could have done better. And with that, thank you guys for watching, and we'll see you guys on the next video.